The setting sun painted the South Pacific sky in brilliant strokes of orange and purple as the small ferry approached Blue Lagoon Resort, its weathered hull cutting through the turquoise waters that gave the island its name. The resort itself was a collection of luxury bungalows scattered across the pristine beach and perched on stilts over the crystal-clear lagoon, connected by wooden walkways that seemed to float above the gentle waves. Through the salt-sprayed windows of the ferry's cabin, Marcus Kane watched the approaching island with eyes that seemed to absorb every detail, from the dense jungle rising behind the resort to the specific layout of the buildings and the number of boats moored at the private dock. Old habits died hard, even after 5 years out of the service. "First time at Blue Lagoon, sir?" the ferry captain asked, his weather-beaten face creasing into a friendly smile. "Before we continue with Kane's response, tell us where you're watching. And if you enjoy stories of courage in paradise, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow's tale will leave you speechless." "Something like that," Kane replied, his voice carrying the kind of quiet confidence that came from years of command. He adjusted the vintage dive watch on his wrist, a habit he'd developed during countless missions when timing meant the difference between life and death. His cargo shorts and tropical shirt might have screamed tourist, but there was something in his posture, in the way his eyes never stopped moving, that set him apart from the other vacationers. The resort's manager, Helena Santos, stood at the end of the dock, her professional smile faltering slightly as she watched Kane step off the ferry. Unlike the other guests who arrived clutching designer luggage and chattering excitedly about their upcoming vacation, Kane carried only a weathered backpack and moved with the fluid grace of a predator despite his relaxed tourist attire. "Welcome to Blue Lagoon Resort, Mr. Kane," Helena said, extending her hand. "We're honored to have you stay with us." Kane's handshake was firm but controlled, and Helena couldn't help but notice the calluses that spoke of years handling something. "Far more serious than office equipment. Beautiful location," Kane observed, his eyes scanning the tree line behind the resort. "Isolated." "That's our main selling point," Helena replied, leading him along the wooden walkway toward the overwater. "Bungalows. We're the only resort on this side of the island. Perfect for guests seeking privacy and exclusivity." What Helena didn't mention was how that isolation had recently become a source of concern. The local authorities had warned of increased rebel activity in the region, former military personnel turned mercenaries who had been targeting remote luxury locations. 3 resorts on neighboring islands had already been hit, their wealthy guests held for ransom, while insurance companies scrambled to meet demands. As they walked, Kane noted the resort's security measures, or rather, the lack thereof. A single guard booth near the dock, minimal surveillance cameras, and staff who seemed more focused on carrying cocktails than maintaining vigilance. The resort's isolation, while appealing to honeymooners and celebrities seeking privacy, was its greatest vulnerability. The other guests barely noticed Kane's arrival, too engrossed in their own vacation pleasures. A group of young entrepreneurs celebrated their latest startup success at the beachfront bar, their laughter carrying across the water. An elderly couple strolled hand in hand along the shore, while children splashed in the shallows under their parents' watchful eyes. But Kane's attention was drawn to a different group, 4 men seated at a corner table of the open-air restaurant. Their casual resort wear couldn't hide their military bearing, and their careful positioning gave them clear sightlines of both the dock and the main resort entrance. Like Kane, they seemed to be constantly scanning their surroundings, but their purpose felt different, predatory rather than protective. "Your bungalow is our finest overwater suite," Helena said, stopping at the end of a private walkway. "Complete privacy, unobstructed views of the lagoon and sunset." She handed him the key card, her professional smile still in place, but unable to completely mask her underlying tension. Kane accepted the key with a slight nod. "Tell me, Ms. Santos, how long have those gentlemen been staying at the resort?" He gestured subtly toward the four men at the restaurant. Helena's composure cracked slightly. They arrived 3 days ago. Said they were old friends planning a reunion. She hesitated, then added in a lower voice, "They ask a lot of questions about our other guests, especially the ones in the premium bungalows." "I see," Kane replied softly. "And your security team?" "Just 2 guards, 1 for each shift," Helena admitted. "We've never needed more before. This isn't the kind of place where—" She trailed off, unsure how to express her growing concerns. To a guest, even one who seemed to understand the situation better than she did, "where trouble follows," Kane finished for her, his voice carrying a weight that suggested he was intimately familiar with how quickly paradise could turn to chaos. "Don't worry, Ms. Santos. I'm just here for the diving. The lagoon has quite a reputation among underwater photography enthusiasts." But as Helena left him to settle in, Kane's hand brushed against the hidden compartment in his backpack, feeling the reassuring outline of equipment that had nothing to do with underwater photography. The sun dipped lower on the horizon, casting long shadows across the resort's wooden walkways, and somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled across the ocean like nature's own warning of the storm to come. In his bungalow, Kane unpacked methodically, his movements efficient and purposeful. The room's massive windows offered a 180-degree view of the lagoon, but his eyes kept returning to the reflection of the 4 men still seated at the restaurant, their casual tourist demeanor betrayed by the subtle radio earpieces they thought no one had noticed. Paradise, Kane knew from bitter experience, had a way of becoming a battlefield when you least expected it. The next morning dawned with a brilliance that seemed almost defiant of the tension building beneath the resort's tranquil surface. Kane sat at the beachfront cafe, a coffee cooling before him, as he maintained his cover of reading the morning news on his tablet. In reality, he was watching the 4 men from the previous evening as they canvassed the resort with practiced casualness. Through the tablet's reflection, he observed their pattern. 2 men circled the perimeter, while 2 others engaged with guests, their questions seemingly innocent but focused on gathering intelligence about occupations, travel schedules, and most tellingly, financial status. They paid particular attention to a Saudi oil executive and his family in the premium beachfront villa. Maria, a young waitress with keen eyes and quick movements, approached Kane's table. "More coffee, sir?" she asked, but her expression carried a weight beyond simple customer service. Kane noticed how she kept glancing at the 4 men, her hands trembling slightly as she held the coffee pot. "Thank you," Kane replied softly. "How long have you worked here, Maria?" 3 years, she answered, lowering her voice. "It's usually so peaceful here, but lately—" She trailed off, her eyes darting toward the men again. "They've been asking questions about the guests." Kane's voice remained conversational, but his eyes never stopped tracking the men's movements. Maria nodded, almost imperceptibly. "And about security procedures, staff schedules. Yesterday, I saw one of them testing the lock on the resort's communications. A room." She paused, then added, "Mr. Kane, you're different from our usual guests, the way you move, how you observe everything. Are you just a tourist?" Kane interrupted gently, interested in underwater photography, but he slipped her a business card with a number written on the back. "If you notice anything unusual, call this number, day or night." The morning progressed with the typical rhythm of a luxury resort. Guests drifted between the pool and beach, children splashed in the shallows, and couples lounged in the sun. But beneath this peaceful veneer, Kane detected the subtle signs of an operation being prepared. The 4 men had established overlapping patrol patterns, and their conversations via earpiece increased in frequency. At the dive shop, Kane signed up for an afternoon excursion while subtly examining the resort's boat arrangements. The dive master, a weathered Australian named Cooper, walked him through the standard safety briefing. Quite a collection of scars you've got there, mate, Cooper observed, as Kane tried on a wetsuit. The comment was casual, but his eyes held a knowing look. The faded marks on Kane's torso told stories of combat and survival that no vacation could hide. Rock climbing accidents, Kane replied with the practiced ease of someone used to deflecting questions. But Cooper just nodded, his expression suggesting he recognized a fellow professional. You know, Cooper said quietly, checking the air gauges on the tanks, I've noticed our friends over there taking a keen interest in the boat schedules, particularly the supply runs to the mainland. Kane adjusted his dive computer, his movements deliberate. Have they signed up for any excursions? No, Cooper replied, but they've been asking about the depth of the lagoon, currents, underwater access points to the resort. He paused, then added, I used to serve too. Royal Australian, Navy clearance diver, those men. They're planning something, and it's not a bloody holiday photo album. Before Kane could respond, one of the four men approached the dive shop. He was the largest of the group, with a thick neck and hands that showed the calluses of regular weapons. Training. His resort wear couldn't hide the outline of a concealed holster under his loose shirt. Beautiful day for diving, the man said, his accent carrying hints of Eastern Europe. I'm Victor. My friends and I were thinking of booking a night dive. For tomorrow, perhaps? Sorry, mate, Cooper replied smoothly. Night dives are suspended. This week, maintenance on the lights. Victor's smile didn't reach his eyes. That's disappointing. We heard the lagoon is spectacular after dark. His gaze shifted to Kane, studying him with the calculated assessment of a trained operator. Kane met his stare with the neutral expression of an experienced tourist. But beneath the surface, two predators recognized each other. The moment stretched, charged with unspoken understanding, before Victor nodded and walked away. Night dive lights work just fine, Cooper muttered once Victor was out of earshot. But something tells me they're not interested in the coral. Kane finished adjusting his equipment, his movements precise. How many access points does the resort have from the water? 3 main ones, Cooper replied, plus the private beaches near the premium villas. During low tide, you could approach from almost anywhere along the reef line. The implications hung in the air between them. The resort's isolation, once its greatest appeal, had become its greatest vulnerability. Paradise was about to become a battlefield, and most of the guests had no idea they were already caught in the crossfire. I'll take that afternoon dive, Kane said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone used to making critical decisions. Around the north side of the lagoon, if possible. Cooper nodded, understanding the unspoken request to survey the resort's most vulnerable approaches. 2 p.m. suit you? Water's clearest then. As Kane walked back to his bungalow to prepare for the dive, he noticed Helena Santos speaking urgently into her phone near the management office, her usual composed demeanor showing cracks of genuine fear. The 4 men had spread out across the resort, their casual tourist act beginning to slip as their real purpose drew closer. The afternoon dive revealed more than just the lagoon's stunning coral formations. As Kane glided through the crystal-clear waters, his experienced eye noted every potential access point to the resort, every shadow that could conceal an approaching boat. Cooper led them along the reef wall, occasionally signaling interesting marine life to maintain their cover as tourists, but both men were mentally mapping approach vectors and defensive positions. Back on the dive boat, drying off in the late afternoon sun, Kane watched through polarized sunglasses as 2 speedboats approached the resort's main dock. The vessels were local models, common enough in these waters, but the way they moved spoke of military precision. 6 more men disembarked, their casual tourist attire doing little to disguise their tactical movements. They split up immediately, integrating with the existing 4 members already positioned around the resort. 10 now, Cooper muttered, securing the dive equipment, and those boats are rigged for night running. No navigation lights, modified engines. His voice carried the certainty of someone who'd seen similar preparations before. Maria hurried down the dock as they tied up the dive boat, her face tight with worry. "Mr. Kane," she called, trying to keep her voice casual while conveying urgency. "There's a message about your dinner reservation." Kane followed her to a quiet corner near the dive shop. "They've disabled the satellite phone in the communications room," she whispered, "and I overheard them talking about a package arrival tonight. They thought I couldn't understand their language, but my grandmother was from the same region." "You did well," Kane replied softly, his mind already processing the implications. "Is there a staff entrance to the communications room?" "Through the maintenance corridor, but they've posted one of their men nearby." Maria's hands twisted nervously in her apron. "Mr. Kane, my sister works here too, in housekeeping. If something's going to happen—" "Get word to the staff quietly," Kane instructed. "Tell them to be ready to move quickly if necessary. But don't raise any alarms yet. These men are professionals. They'll have planned for panic." As Maria hurried away, Kane made his way to his bungalow, his movements unhurried but purposeful. The sun was beginning to set, painting the lagoon in shades of gold and crimson that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. He noticed Helena Santos watching from her office window, her phone pressed to her ear in what he suspected was another failed attempt to reach mainland authorities. In his bungalow, Kane opened the hidden compartment in his backpack. The equipment inside reflected years of experience in hostile situations. A compact tactical vest that could be concealed under resort wear, communication devices that operated on encrypted frequencies, and other tools that no ordinary tourist would carry. As he prepared, his mind drifted back to another paradise-turned battlefield, years ago in the Philippines, where his unit had prevented a similar hostile takeover attempt at a coastal resort. A knock at his door interrupted his preparations. Through the peephole, he saw Victor standing outside, still maintaining his tourist facade, but with an underlying tension that suggested the operation was moving into its next phase. "Good evening, neighbor," Victor called through the door. "The resort is hosting a special dinner tonight. All guests are encouraged to attend." The words were casual, but the tone carried a subtle threat. Kane opened the door, presenting the relaxed demeanor of a tourist looking forward to dinner. "Sounds wonderful. What's the occasion?" Victor's smile remained fixed, but his eyes were cold as they took in Kane's bungalow, noting the positions of furniture, windows, and potential weapons. "A celebration of local culture. Very traditional. It would be unfortunate to miss it." "I'll be there," Kane assured him, matching Victor's predatory smile with one of his own. For a moment the pretense dropped away as two professional operators recognized the deadly dance they were engaged in. As Victor walked away, Kane noticed how the other operatives had begun subtly herding guests toward the main dining area. The Saudi executive and his family were already seated at a central table, surrounded by seemingly attentive staff, who Kane now recognized as part of Victor's team. Cooper appeared at the end of the walkway, his posture casual, but his eyes alert. "They've got men covering all 3 docks now," he reported quietly as he passed. "Boats are fueled and ready. Whatever they're planning, it's happening tonight." Kane checked his watch, the same one that had accompanied him through countless operations. The sun was sinking rapidly now, and with darkness would come the moment when paradise revealed its teeth. He could see Maria and her sister quietly, spreading word among the trusted staff, while Helena Santos circulated among the guests, her forced smile barely masking her growing fear. The evening breeze carried the sound of traditional island music from the main dining area, a cheerful melody that stood in stark contrast to the tension building beneath the resort's peaceful surface. As Kane prepared to make his way to dinner, he activated one of his concealed communications devices, sending a pre-arranged signal to contacts who owed him favors from his days in service. Whether help would arrive in time was another question. Entirely, the main dining area of Blue Lagoon Resort had been transformed for the evening, tiki torches and lanterns casting flickering shadows across the faces of guests who had no idea they were about to become hostages. Kane sat at a corner table, positioned to observe both the main entrance and the waterfront access points. The 10 operators had spread themselves strategically throughout the space, their tourist disguises still in place, but their movements becoming more purposeful as night fell. Victor's team had arranged the seating carefully, placing high-value targets like the Saudi executive's family in the center where they could be easily controlled. Kane noticed how they'd positioned other guests based on perceived threat levels. Younger, fitter men near their operators, elderly couples and families with children closer to the exits where they could be quickly herded into containment. Maria moved between tables with forced cheerfulness, topping off water glasses and wine. As she passed Kane's table, she whispered without breaking stride, "They've locked down the communications room completely. Elena, in housekeeping, says they're staging equipment in one of the empty bungalows, zip ties, hoods, satellite phones." Kane acknowledged the information with an imperceptible nod, his mind calculating angles and options. The resort's layout, which he'd memorized during his initial reconnaissance, offered both challenges and opportunities. The scattered bungalows and wooden walkways could provide cover and multiple approach vectors, but they also meant civilians would be spread out once the operation began. Cooper had positioned himself near the resort's main boat dock, ostensibly closing up the dive shop, but actually monitoring the 2 speedboats that would serve as the attackers' escape vehicles. He caught Kane's eye briefly, tapping his watch. The dive master had noticed something in their preparations that suggested timing. The resort's house band began playing, their upbeat island tunes, a surreal soundtrack to the tension building. In the air, Helena Santos circulated among the tables, her professional smile strained as she watched Victor's men slowly tightening their net around the unsuspecting guests. Kane's attention was drawn to subtle movements at the dining area's periphery. 3 more men had appeared, carrying what looked like entertainment equipment but moved with the unmistakable weight of tactical gear. The pieces were falling into place. They would use the evening's cultural performance as cover to launch their operation. "Ladies and gentlemen," Victor announced, standing at the front of the dining area with a champagne glass in hand, "tonight, Blue Lagoon Resort has prepared a special celebration of local traditions. We ask that everyone remain seated as the performance begins." Kane watched as Victor's men began quietly securing the area's exit points. 2 operators moved to positions behind the Saudi executive's family, their hands casually near their concealed weapons. The trap was about to spring. The first hint that something was wrong came from an unexpected quarter. A young boy, no more than 7, broke away from his parents' table, running past one of Victor's men toward the beach. The operator instinctively reached for him with a tactical grip rather than the gentle redirect a normal resort staff member would use. The boy's mother noticed, her eyes widening with sudden understanding. Kane saw the moment the operations timing began to unravel. The mother's gasp of recognition triggered a ripple of awareness through the closest guests. Victor's men responded by dropping their tourist facade, reaching for weapons. Now, Victor called out, his voice carrying an edge of menace. "Everyone stay calm and seated. This evening's entertainment will be slightly different than advertised." But Kane had already begun moving. As Victor's announcement diverted attention forward, Kane slipped one of his pre-positioned devices under the table, a small but powerful signal jammer that would disrupt their tactical communications. The house band, who had been playing through the rising tension, suddenly stopped as one of Victor's men roughly pushed them aside to secure the stage area. The abrupt silence seemed to crystallize the moment, Paradise's illusion shattering like glass. 3 minutes ago, this resort's external communications were cut, Victor announced, all pretense gone now. The mainland authorities are about to be fed a pre-recorded all-clear message. For the next 24 hours, your comfort and safety depend entirely on your cooperation and your insurance policies. Kane watched as fear spread through the crowd of guests, but he also noted something else. The resort staff, warned earlier through Maria's quiet network, were already implementing emergency protocols. Housekeepers were discreetly guiding children toward pre-planned hiding spots, while kitchen staff created subtle barricades with serving carts and furniture. Cooper, still by the dive shop, had begun slowly flooding the dock area with activated dive lights, creating patches of blinding underwater illumination that would complicate any waterborne escape attempts. The dive master caught Kane's eye again, indicating he'd accessed the emergency fuel shut-off for the boats. As Victor continued outlining his demands to the increasingly terrified guests, Kane felt the weight of his concealed tactical vest, each tool and weapon positioned for silent, efficient access. The signal jammer would buy them a few minutes of communications chaos, but soon Victor's team would switch to backup frequencies. Paradise was about to become a battleground, but this time, the predators had unknowingly trapped themselves with something far more dangerous than mere tourists. As if emphasizing the point, distant thunder rolled across the lagoon. A storm was coming, in more ways than one. Victor's men moved through the dining area with practiced efficiency, cable ties appearing in their hands as they began securing guests. The Saudi executive's wife clutched her children close, while her husband maintained a dignity that suggested this wasn't his first encounter with violence. Other guests reacted with varying degrees of panic and resignation, their dream vacations transformed into a nightmare. Kane remained seated, allowing himself to be zip-tied like the others, though the restraints went over carefully concealed blade access points. He watched as Victor's team began separating the guests into groups, wealthy targets in one area, potential threats in another, hotel staff corralled near the kitchen. "Your phones and valuables, please," one of Victor's men announced, moving between tables with a collection bag. "Cooperation will make this experience much more comfortable for everyone." His accent carried hints of Serbian military training, matching Kane's initial assessment of their background. The signal jammer had done its work. Kane observed the growing frustration among Victor's men as they struggled with their communications, forced to rely on hand signals and direct contact. It wouldn't last long. Professionals like these would have redundant systems, but the disruption had already created small gaps in their control pattern. Maria caught Kane's eye as she was herded toward the staff group. She gave an almost imperceptible nod. During the initial confusion, several younger guests had been successfully hidden by the staff, following the hasty protocols Kane had helped establish. More importantly, her sister Eleanor had managed to reach the resort's secondary radio equipment, hidden in the dive shop's maintenance room. Cooper was now being marched into the dining area, his hands raised. "Found this one by the dive shop," one of Victor's men reported. "Says he was just closing up." "Search the area," Victor ordered, "and check the boat fuel lines." But Kane knew it was already too late. Cooper had accomplished his task during the initial confusion. The speedboat's fuel systems were compromised, thoroughly but invisibly. Thunder rolled closer across the lagoon, and the first heavy drops of rain began to fall. The weather would work in their favor, Kane knew. Poor visibility and the sound of rain would help mask any counter-moves, while the wet wooden walkways would complicate his opponent's movements. "Ladies and gentlemen," Victor addressed the assembled. Hostages, raindrops beginning to darken his expensive resort shirt. "We're moving this gathering indoors. Please walk calmly with your assigned escorts to the main ballroom." His tone was almost cordial, but his eyes were cold as they swept across the crowd, lingering briefly on Kane. As the guests were herded toward the ballroom, Kane noted the deployment pattern of Victor's men. 3 on perimeter watch, 2 handling, guest movement, 2 securing the ballroom, leaving 3 including Victor for command and control. Professional distribution, but the weather was forcing them to adjust their original plan. Helena Santos was being escorted separately, her role as resort manager making her a valuable asset for accessing secure areas. Kane watched as she was led toward the administrative offices, presumably to assist with accessing the resort systems. But her path would take her past one of his pre-positioned equipment caches. The rain intensified, driven by gusting winds that made the tiki torches sputter and dance. Lightning flashed across the lagoon, illuminating the resort in stark bursts that created disorienting shadows. Kane allowed himself to be guided toward the ballroom, counting steps and memorizing the positions of Victor's men. "Move it," the Serbian operator behind him growled, shoving him forward. Kane stumbled slightly, using the movement to test his restraints and confirm the position of his concealed tools. The man's tactical awareness was good, but not good enough to notice how his captive's stumble had allowed him to palm a small object from beneath one of the dining tables. Inside the ballroom, the separation continued. Wealthy guests were positioned near the stage, others along the walls. Kane noted that Victor's men had already prepared the room, securing windows and positioning emergency lighting in case of power failure. They'd done their homework, but they'd made one critical assumption, that their operation would face only token resistance from untrained civilians. Cooper was placed near Kane, both men identified as potential problems due to their physical condition and alertness. "Nice weather, for it," Cooper muttered, his voice barely audible above the storm. The comment confirmed what Kane had suspected. The dive master had experience with wetwork operations. Through the ballroom's windows, lightning illuminated the lagoon in strobic bursts. Kane caught glimpses of movement, dark shapes approaching. The resort from multiple angles, using the weather as cover. Victor's reinforcements arriving right on schedule. But there was something else, something in the way the shapes moved through the water that suggested a different kind of training. Maria and several other staff members were being forced to serve water to the guests, maintaining a facade of hospitality. Even during a hostage situation, as she passed Kane, she whispered, "Elena got through, 20 minutes." The message confirmed what Kane had hoped. His own backup was also en route. The storm reached its full intensity, rain hammering the ballroom's roof, while thunder rolled continuously overhead. Victor stood at the front of the room, coordinating with his team and maintaining control of the increasingly frightened hostages. But Kane saw the subtle signs of stress in the man's posture. The weather was complicating their timeline, forcing adjustments to their carefully planned operation. Paradise had become a battlefield, but the coming fight would be decided not by the strength of weapons or numbers, but by preparation, timing, and the ability to turn nature itself into a weapon. As another lightning flash illuminated the room, Kane began his final mental preparations. The storm would peak in approximately 15 minutes, and with it, all hell would break loose. The ballroom had become a pressure cooker of tension and fear, with Victor's men maintaining their professional control even as the storm raged outside. Through the windows, the Paradise Resort had transformed into a dark maze of rain-lashed walkways and thrashing palm trees. The once peaceful lagoon, now a churning mass of whitecaps, illuminated by frequent lightning. Kane watched as Victor consulted, quietly with his second-in-command, their body language betraying growing concern about their timeline. The reinforcements they'd glimpsed approaching through the water hadn't yet made contact. The storm was likely delaying their approach. "Status check!" Victor barked into his backup radio, having abandoned the compromised primary frequency. The response was fragmented, broken by static and thunder, but Kane caught enough to confirm his assessment. The weather was disrupting their carefully planned operation, forcing them to adapt. Helena Santos was brought back to the ballroom, her face pale but composed. Kane noted the slight bulge in her jacket pocket. She'd found the package he'd hidden along her expected route. The resort manager was escorted to a seat near the other high-value hostages, her eyes briefly meeting Kane's with a slight nod. "Sir," one of Victor's men approached, water streaming from his tactical gear. "The boats are experiencing mechanical issues. Fuel systems aren't reading correctly." The man lowered his voice, but Kane's trained hearing caught the words. "And we've lost contact with teams 3 and 4 on the north side." Victor's expression darkened. "Check the emergency channels and get someone to the communications room. I want direct contact with the mainland team now." But Kane knew those efforts would prove futile. During the initial confusion, Cooper had done more than just sabotage the boats. The storm reached a new intensity, the wind howling through the resort's wooden structures with an almost supernatural fury. The emergency lighting flickered, creating momentary patches of darkness that Kane carefully memorized. Each power fluctuation, each rolling wave of thunder brought him closer to the moment when paradise would reveal its teeth. Maria moved among the hostages, offering water with shaking hands. As she passed Kane, she nearly stumbled, using the moment to slip something beneath his chair. A simple paper clip, but in trained hands, it was all he needed. Cooper, seated nearby, caught the exchange and shifted slightly, positioning himself to block the view of Victor's men. Through the windows, Kane caught another glimpse of movement in the lagoon. This time, the shapes moved with a different purpose, a familiar pattern that spoke of maritime special operations training. His backup was in position, using the storm as cover, just as he'd planned. Victor must have sensed something too. He ordered additional men to the waterfront. But the rain and darkness made effective surveillance almost impossible. The operators were professionals, but they were fighting against both the elements and an increasingly unstable situation. Kane felt the paperclip working against his restraints, the practiced movements hidden by his casual posture. Years of training in escape techniques were paying off. The zip ties had been applied professionally, but no restraint was perfect. Suddenly, one of Victor's men burst into the ballroom, his tactical gear soaked and his expression urgent. "Sir, we've got a problem. The dive shop, someone accessed the emergency equipment. Tanks, gear, underwater lights." The implications hung in the air. Their waterfront security had been compromised. Victor's response was immediate. "Lock down the entire water access. No one approaches from any direction. Get the night vision equipment from the cache." But Kane knew it was already too late. Cooper's earlier activities had ensured that much of that equipment would prove unreliable. The Saudi executive's young daughter began crying, the stress finally overwhelming her. As her mother tried to comfort her, one of Victor's men moved toward them with obvious irritation. Kane tensed, preparing to move early if necessary, but Helena Santos intervened. "Let me help," she said, her voice carrying an authority that gave the operator pause. "Children require a gentler approach." The man hesitated, then nodded curtly. Kane noted how this small act of compassion created another tiny crack in their tactical control. Lightning split the sky, followed immediately by deafening thunder that shook the ballroom's windows. In that brilliant moment of illumination, Kane saw what the others missed. Dark figures moving with deadly purpose through the resort's walkways, using the storm's fury as cover. The zip ties finally gave way, though Kane maintained his position, appearing still restrained. Cooper had also managed to work free, his experience with diving knots proving useful. Around the room, Kane noted other small signs of resistance. Maria's sister Elena had managed to distribute makeshift weapons to some of the staff, while several guests had shifted into more tactically advantageous positions. Victor paced at the front of the room, his professional demeanor showing signs of strain. The operation was deviating further from their planned timeline with each passing minute. His men were having to adapt to deteriorating conditions, their tactical advantage eroding as the storm's chaos increased. Through it all, Kane remained still, gathering information and waiting for the perfect moment. The storm would peak in less than 5 minutes, and with it would come a convergence of factors: the disabled security systems, the compromised equipment, the hidden resistance, and the approaching rescue team. Paradise was about to remind everyone why some of the most dangerous predators moved in absolute silence. The storm reached its crescendo, rain hammering against the ballroom's windows with such intensity that it nearly drowned out all other sounds. Lightning strikes came almost continuously now, creating a strobic effect that transformed the room into a series of frozen tableaus. Victor consulting with his increasingly nervous men, hostages huddled in groups, and Kane still appearing. Restrained but coiled like a spring about to release, a massive thunderclap shook the building, and in that instant, the power failed completely. The emergency lighting kicked in, but flickered erratically, creating pools of uncertain illumination. Kane heard the subtle click of night vision goggles being activated. Victor's men had prepared for this possibility, but their equipment had been compromised hours earlier during Cooper's methodical sabotage. "Check the perimeter," Victor ordered, his voice barely audible above the storm. "Full radio contact every 30 seconds. But as his men moved to comply, Kane noted their increasing uncertainty. The night vision equipment was giving them conflicting information, shadows appearing and disappearing in ways that suggested electronic interference. The Saudi executive's wife clutched her children closer as one of Victor's men stumbled nearby, cursing as his night vision gear malfunctioned. The operator switched to a tactical flashlight, but the beams seemed to fracture in the rain-streaked windows, creating more confusion than illumination. Kane caught Cooper's eye and gave an almost imperceptible nod. The dive master responded by suddenly clutching his chest and falling forward, creating a distraction that drew the attention of the nearest guard. In that same moment, Helena Santos accidentally knocked over a tray of water glasses, the shattering sound masking other, more subtle movements throughout the room. Through the windows, Kane saw the first real sign that their counterattack had begun. Underwater lights in the lagoon, positioned earlier by Cooper, began activating in a precise sequence. To the untrained eye, it might have looked random, but Kane recognized the pattern. Standard maritime special operations signals, indicating positions and readiness. "Sir," one of Victor's men called from the doorway, his voice tight with professional concern. "We've lost contact with the waterfront teams, and the thermal imaging is showing inconsistencies." The operator's hesitation spoke volumes. Their technological advantage was evaporating, and with it, their tactical control of the situation. Victor's response was immediate, but revealed his growing frustration. "Get men on the walkways. Physical confirmation of all positions. No one approaches from any direction." But as his operators moved to comply, Kane saw what they didn't: the way the rain-slicked wooden walkways had been subtly prepared. Certain boards loosened, others made deliberately unstable. Maria and her sister had positioned themselves near the kitchen entrance, where earlier they had ensured certain equipment was left in strategic locations. Other staff members had slowly shifted positions throughout the room, moving closer to pre-designated points that Kane had identified during the initial planning. The Saudi executive caught Kane's eye briefly, and a look of understanding passed. Between them, the man's military bearing and calm demeanor suddenly made sense. He'd recognized another operator early on, and had been quietly preparing his family for what was coming. Lightning illuminated the lagoon again, and this time Victor saw it too, dark shapes moving through the water with professional precision. His reaction was telling. "Change of plans," he announced, his voice carrying an edge of urgency. "We move the primary targets now, the rest stay here as insurance." But as his men moved to implement this new strategy, everything happened at once. The underwater lights in the lagoon suddenly went dark, plunging the waterfront into total darkness. At the same moment, a series of small explosions around the resort, charges placed earlier by Cooper, created multiple distractions. Kane moved. His freed hands found the tactical baton he'd palmed earlier, and in one fluid motion, he disabled the nearest operator. Cooper launched himself at another guard, his diving muscles making short work of the engagement. Throughout the room, prepared, staff and guests began implementing the plans they'd rehearsed in whispers over the past hours. Victor shouted orders, but the storm and chaos swallowed his words. His night vision equipment, compromised earlier, showed phantom targets appearing and disappearing in the rain. The professional calm that had marked his operation began to crack as he realized they were fighting an enemy they hadn't prepared. For through the windows, dark figures emerged from the lagoon, moving with the precise coordination that only came from years of special operations training. Kane recognized their approach pattern. It was one he'd helped develop years ago, designed to overwhelm professional opposition by attacking from multiple angles simultaneously. The ballroom erupted into controlled chaos. Maria and Elena's kitchen equipment became improvised weapons in trained hands. The Saudi executive, dropping all pretense now, moved his family toward a pre-designated safe area while providing covering action. Hotel staff, who had seemed broken by fear, revealed themselves to be part of a coordinated resistance. Paradise had become a battlefield, but not the one Victor and his men had prepared for. They had expected to fight untrained civilians. Instead, they found themselves facing an operation planned by someone who had spent years turning chaos itself into a weapon. As lightning illuminated the scene once more, Kane moved through the combat with lethal grace, his movements economical and precise. The storm that had seemed to work in the attacker's favor had become their undoing, each element of nature transformed into a tactical advantage by careful preparation and expert timing. The fighting in the ballroom moved with the precise choreography of a deadly dance. Kane flowed between targets like a ghost, each strike calculated for maximum efficiency with minimal collateral risk. His years of special operations training transformed everyday objects into devastating weapons. A serving tray became a shield, a broken chair leg, an improvised baton. Victor's men struggled to adapt to the rapidly deteriorating situation. Their night vision equipment, compromised earlier, created more confusion than clarity. The storm's fury masked the approach of the rescue team, while the rain-slicked walkways turned every tactical movement into a dangerous gamble. "Control the exits!" Victor shouted, his professional demeanor cracking as he realized the depth of their miscalculation. But his men were already engaged in multiple conflicts throughout the room. Cooper had disabled 2 operators using techniques that spoke of more than just diving experience, while Maria and Elena coordinated the hotel staff in a series of precisely timed disruptions. Lightning illuminated the scene in strobing flashes, creating a surreal backdrop to the combat. Through the windows, Kane caught glimpses of his backup team moving through the resort's exterior, dark figures flowing through the rain with predatory grace. The storm hadn't just provided cover for their approach. It had become a weapon. In their arsenal, the Saudi executive had positioned his family behind an overturned table, his movements revealing military training as he helped coordinate the civilian evacuation. 3 meters to your left," he called to Kane in tactical shorthand, warning of an approaching operator. Kane responded without looking, his elbow finding a precise point on the man's neck that sent him crumpling to the floor. Victor, recognizing the collapse of his carefully planned operation, made a decisive move toward his high-value targets. But as he reached for the Saudi executive's daughter, Kane appeared between them. The two men locked eyes, years of professional experience recognizing each other's capabilities. "You're not what you seemed," Victor said, his voice carrying a mixture of respect and frustration. "Special forces?" "Just a tourist," Kane replied softly, but his stance told a different story. His body had settled into a familiar combat position, one taught to elite operators for close-quarter combat in confined spaces. The fight that followed was a masterclass in tactical combat. Victor's Serbian military training showed in every move, each strike designed to disable or kill, but Kane's responses flowed like water, turning the man's own momentum against him. The surrounding chaos seemed to fade away as two professionals engaged in their deadly dance. Through the windows, the rescue team had begun their coordinated assault. The sound of precision breaching charges mingled with the thunder, while flashbangs created additional disorientation for Victor's remaining men. Kane had planned each element carefully, the timing of the breaches, the positioning of the charges, even the way the storm would mask their final approach. Maria and Elena had successfully guided most of the civilians to predetermined safe zones, using routes planned during the initial hours of the crisis. The hotel staff, briefed earlier through whispered conversations and subtle signals, implemented their roles with surprising effectiveness. Even the Saudi executive's wife had revealed hidden depths, calmly helping to manage the evacuation while maintaining cover for her husband's tactical movements. Victor, realizing his position was untenable, attempted a desperate gambit. His hand moved toward a concealed weapon, but Kane had anticipated this. Their brief exchange of words had been more than just conversation. It had allowed Kane to maneuver them into a position where Victor's draw would be compromised. The following sequence happened in the space of heartbeats. Victor's weapon cleared its holster just as Kane moved, his hands finding precise pressure points that turned the man's own muscular tension against him. The gun clattered to the floor, as Victor discovered that his extensive combat training had gaps, specifically the counter-terrorism techniques Kane had helped develop during his classified operations. "Your men are down," Kane said quietly, maintaining his control hold. "The boats are disabled. Your backup in the water has been intercepted. It's over." His voice carried no triumph, just the professional certainty of someone who had orchestrated similar operations from both sides. Outside, the storm began to abate, as if nature itself recognized the shifting tide of battle. The rescue team had secured the resort's perimeter, their efficiency speaking to extensive preparation and coordination. Cooper emerged from a brief skirmish near the kitchen, nodding to Kane to indicate the last pocket of resistance had been neutralized. Helena Santos approached, her composure restored now that the situation was under control. "The authorities have been notified," she reported. "Real ones this time, and the guests are safe in the secure locations you designated." Victor, still held in Kane's inexorable control technique, finally allowed himself to acknowledge their defeat. "Who are you really?" he asked, professional curiosity temporarily overriding his situation. Kane's response was interrupted by the arrival of the tactical response team, their movements displaying the same precision he had drilled into countless operators during his years of service. The team leader approached, recognition flickering in his eyes as he saw Kane. "Area secured, sir," the team leader reported, his use of "sir" revealing more than any explanation could. "Hostiles contained, no civilian casualties, just like you planned it." The last of the emergency lighting flickered and stabilized as the resort's backup systems engaged properly. In its steady illumination, the ballroom showed surprisingly little, a damage testament to the controlled nature of the combat. Kane finally released Victor into the custody of the tactical team, his movements displaying none of the strain from the intense fighting. Dawn broke over Blue Lagoon Resort, the rising sun painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that seemed almost apologetic for the night's violence. The storm had passed, leaving behind a pristine morning that made the events of the previous hours feel like a distant nightmare. Local authorities had arrived in force, their boats dotting the now calm lagoon as they processed the scene and detained Victor's men. Kane stood on the deck of his overwater bungalow, watching the methodical activity below. The tactical response team moved with practiced efficiency, gathering evidence and securing the area. Several familiar faces among them nodded in his direction, operators he'd trained or worked with during his years of service. Maria approached, along the walkway carrying 2 cups of coffee. "The guests are asking about you," she said, offering him one of the cups. "They want to thank the quiet tourist who helped save them." A small smile touched her lips. "Though I think some of them have figured out you're not exactly a tourist. Let them keep wondering," Kane replied softly, accepting the coffee. "Better for everyone if I remain just another visitor who got caught up in events." His eyes tracked a patrol boat as it made another sweep of the lagoon perimeter. Cooper joined them, his diving gear slung over one shoulder. "Found these in the water," he said, dropping a waterproof bag containing disabled surveillance equipment. "Your friends were thorough, completely compromised Victor's underwater approach routes." The Saudi executive appeared next, his military bearing now openly displayed. "Colonel," he said, addressing Kane with the respect of one professional to another, "my government would like to express its gratitude, discreetly, of course." Kane nodded, understanding the layers of meaning in the man's words. "No need, Major," he replied, using the Saudis' real rank. "Just make sure your intelligence services update their files on Victor's organization. They're more extensive than previously thought." Helena Santos approached with several official-looking individuals, investigators and resort corporate representatives. Her composed demeanor had returned, though now it carried an edge of newfound confidence. "The ownership wants to thank you properly," she began, but Kane held up a hand to stop her. "The best thanks would be improving the resort's security," he said quietly. "Cooper has some suggestions. He's more qualified than he appears." The dive master grinned at this, his own background in Australian special operations no longer completely hidden. As the morning progressed, the resort began returning to some semblance of normalcy. Staff cleared away the evidence of the night's combat, while guests emerged from their rooms, their experiences already transforming into stories they'd tell for years to come. Maria's sister Elena supervised the kitchen staff as they prepared breakfast, the ordinary routine helping to settle nerves. But Kane noticed how she'd reorganized the kitchen layout, keeping certain implements within easy reach. The events of the night had left their mark on everyone. The tactical team leader approached Kane as he watched the activity. "Command sends their regards," he said quietly. "They're impressed you managed this without any civilian casualties. Victor's men are singing like birds in interrogation. Apparently this operation was part of something bigger." Kane wasn't surprised. He'd suspected Victor's group was testing protocols for larger-scale resort takeovers, using the isolated location to perfect their techniques. "Make sure the intelligence gets to the right people," he replied, "especially about their maritime infiltration capabilities." The Saudi executive's wife appeared with her children, who now looked at Kane with a mixture of awe and curiosity. The woman's own bearing reflected her hidden strengths. She'd handled herself with remarkable composure during the crisis. "We're departing soon," she said, her cultured accent carrying warmth. "But my husband and I wanted you to know. We understand the need for discretion. Your involvement won't appear in any official statements." Kane appreciated the gesture. His presence at the resort hadn't been entirely coincidental. Intelligence had suggested Victor's group might target this location, but maintaining his cover as a simple tourist served multiple purposes. Cooper approached again, this time with preliminary damage reports from the dive shop. "Most of it's cosmetic," he reported. though I might need to requisition some new equipment. Seems a shame to waste those modified dive tanks on just one operation." The morning sun had risen fully now, its light reflecting off the lagoon's surface and casting shifting patterns on the resort's wooden walkways. Kane watched as guests began to emerge in greater numbers, some heading for breakfast, others drawn to the beach where the storm had left behind seashells and treasures from the deep. Helena Santos joined him for a final conversation. "The corporate office wants to comp your stay," she said with a slight smile, "though I suspect you won't be remaining long." Kane shook his head. "Better if I move on. Quieter that way." His eyes scanned the horizon where the last storm clouds were disappearing. "But you might want to keep Cooper on staff. He's got good instincts, and this place could use someone with his particular skills." The dive master looked up from his equipment inspection, surprise and appreciation crossing his weathered features. It was a generous gesture, offering him a chance to put down roots while maintaining a watchful eye over the resort's security. As the morning wore on, Kane methodically packed his few belongings, carefully concealing the specialized equipment that had helped turn the tide during the night's operation. Through his bungalow's windows, he could see the last of Victor's men being escorted onto police boats, their professional demeanor now replaced by the resigned expressions of operators who recognized they'd been outmaneuvered at every turn. Maria knocked softly on his door, carrying a package wrapped in simple brown paper. "From the kitchen staff," she said as Kane invited her in. "Helena said you might need supplies for your journey." The hidden meaning was clear. They'd prepared food that could be eaten on the move, understanding that men like Kane rarely lingered after operations concluded. "Your sister has good instincts," Kane replied, accepting the package. "Both of you do. The way you handled yourselves last night, that wasn't just luck or quick thinking." He studied her with those quiet, observant eyes that seemed to see beneath surfaces. Maria smiled slightly. "Our father was military. Before he moved us here for a quieter life, he taught us to be prepared, to watch, to understand people." She paused, then added, "He would have recognized you for what you are, just like we did." Through the open door, they could hear Cooper conducting an impromptu security assessment with the resort's regular staff, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd found a new purpose. The dive master had shed his casual persona, now openly sharing his expertise with people eager to learn. The Saudi executive and his family were preparing for departure, their private seaplane waiting in the lagoon. As Kane watched, the man pulled Cooper aside for a brief conversation, likely arranging for future security consultations. Some good would come from the night's events. Connections made, skills shared, strengths discovered. Helena Santos approached Kane's bungalow, carrying official documents. "The authorities need a statement," she said, though her tone suggested she knew it would be carefully edited. "And there's something else." She hesitated, then continued. "We've received inquiries from 3 other resort groups asking about our security protocols. It seems word travels fast." "Talk to Cooper," Kane replied softly. "He'll know how to handle it. Sometimes the best security is the kind nobody notices until they need it." His hand unconsciously touched the worn dive watch that had accompanied him through countless operations. The tactical response team was completing their final sweep of the resort, their movements reflecting the thoroughness he'd drilled into them during training sessions years ago. Their leader caught Kane's eye and gave a subtle hand signal. Clean extraction, no loose ends. Victor himself was being led to a separate boat, one Kane recognized as belonging to a certain intelligence service. The former operator looked up at Kane's bungalow, professional respect mixing with resignation in his expression. He'd finally realized why his perfect plan had fallen apart. He'd unknowingly challenged someone who wrote the book on resort counter-terrorism operations. "Will, "You ever tell them?" Maria asked quietly, watching the proceedings below. "The guests, I mean. Who you really are. What you really did here." Kane shook his head. "Better if I remain a lucky tourist who kept his head in a crisis. The best operations are the ones that become nothing but stories people tell on their next vacation." His voice carried the weight of experience, of countless missions that would never appear in any official record. The morning had bloomed into a perfect tropical day. The kind tourists traveled thousands of miles to experience. On the beach, children were already playing in the gentle surf, while their parents watched from the shade of palm trees. The resort was returning to its intended purpose, a paradise where people could forget the dangers of the wider world. Cooper appeared in the doorway, his diving gear replaced with more professional attire. "Last of the modified equipment has been recovered," he reported, "and I've started implementing those security upgrades we discussed. The ownership's suddenly very interested in maritime protection protocols." Kane nodded in approval. The dive. Master would be good for this place, bringing his unique combination of special operations experience and local knowledge to bear in protecting paradise. Sometimes the best way to prevent violence was to be quietly, competently prepared for it. Helena Santos returned with final paperwork, but Kane noticed she'd also brought something else. A resort business card with a private number written on the back. "In case you ever want to return," she said simply, "as a real tourist this time." The suggestion brought a rare smile to Kane's face. "Maybe someday," he replied, though they both knew it was unlikely. Men like him didn't take vacations. Not really. They found their rest in brief moments between missions, in the quiet satisfaction of protecting others who would never know they needed protection. Maria helped him carry his bags to the waiting boat, not one of the police launches or official vessels, but a discreet craft that would blur his departure as effectively as his arrival had been masked. The staff members who knew the truth gathered quietly to see him off, their farewells expressed more in looks and nods than words. As the boat pulled away from Blue Lagoon Resort, Kane watched the paradise he'd defended fade into the morning haze. The lagoon was calm now, its surface reflecting the perfect blue sky above. To the casual observer, nothing about the resort suggested the drama that had unfolded during the storm. But he knew that paradise had been changed, not by the violence that had threatened it, but by the quiet strength that had risen to defend it. In the end, that was what mattered. Not the tactical victory or the thwarted operation, but the knowledge that ordinary people had discovered their own capacity for extraordinary courage. 3 months later, Kane sat in a small cafe in Singapore, reading a travel magazine that featured a glowing review of Blue Lagoon Resort. The article praised the location's remarkable attention to security and staff training, noting how the resort had become a model for luxury properties throughout the region. Cooper's influence was evident in every detail, though his name never appeared in print. The Saudi executive's wife had written a private letter that found its way to Kane through discreet channels. She described how her children had processed their experience, transforming fear into understanding about the quiet guardians who moved through the world, protecting others. Her husband had implemented several of Kane's security protocols at his own properties, creating ripples of improvement throughout the industry. Maria and Elena had been promoted to senior management positions, their proven grace under pressure earning them new responsibilities. The sisters had implemented subtle but effective changes to the resort's operations, weaving security awareness into the fabric of daily routines without disturbing the peaceful atmosphere guests came to enjoy. Through his various channels, Kane had kept a distant eye on Victor's organization. The intelligence gathered during that stormy night had led to operations across 3 continents, dismantling networks that had targeted luxury resorts and their wealthy guests. Victor himself had provided valuable information, professional courtesy, finally overriding loyalty to his former employers. A young woman approached Kane's table, moving with the deliberate casualness of another operator. "Command sends regards," she said quietly, sliding into the seat across from him. That business at Blue Lagoon started something interesting. Resort groups are taking security seriously now, but with a light touch. "Your influence, I assume." Kane sipped his coffee, neither confirming nor denying. "Paradise is fragile," he replied softly. "Protect it too obviously. You destroy what you're trying to preserve." "Not obviously enough." He let the thought hang, unfinished. The woman nodded, understanding the delicate balance. "We've identified 3 more potential situations similar to Blue Lagoon. Remote locations, high-value targets, professional operators testing new approaches." She placed a thin folder on the table. "Command thought you might be interested." "I'm retired," Kane said, but his hand still moved to open the folder. The photos inside showed familiar patterns. Isolated resorts, tactical approaches masked as tourist activities, the subtle signs of reconnaissance that only experienced operators would recognize. "Of course you are," the woman smiled. "Just like you were just a tourist at Blue Lagoon." She stood to leave, then paused. "The dive master there, Cooper. He's done good work. Several other resorts have adopted his protocols. Sometimes the best victories are the ones that look like simple improvements in service quality." Kane studied the photos more closely. Each location was unique, but the underlying vulnerabilities were similar to what he'd recognized at Blue Lagoon. Places where Paradise's isolation made it vulnerable, where the very peace guests sought could become a weapon against them. His phone buzzed with a message from Helena Santos. The resort was hosting a security conference disguised as a luxury tourism symposium. Cooper was a featured speaker, though his presentation focused on integrating safety measures with guest experience. The message ended with a renewed invitation for Kane to return, this time truly as a tourist. The idea was tempting in its impossibility. Men like him didn't rest, not really. They found their peace in movement, in the quiet satisfaction of preventing violence before it could shatter the illusions others lived within. His worn dive watch marked time as it had through countless operations, methodically, precisely, marking the moments between necessity and action. The woman had left another card beside the folder, this one bearing only a phone number. Kane recognized the pattern, a new unit being formed, one focused on protecting vulnerable paradises without compromising their essential nature. They wanted his experience, his understanding of how to weave security into the fabric of luxury without letting it show. Through the cafe window, he watched tourists stroll past, their faces bright with the excitement of exploration. None of them knew about the network of quiet professionals who worked to keep their illusions intact, who fought shadows so others could walk in light. Maria's latest update had mentioned changes at Blue Lagoon, subtle improvements in staff, training, strategic positioning of equipment that could serve multiple purposes, the quiet competence that turned hospitality workers into a first line of defense. The resort's bookings had actually increased, its reputation for unobtrusive excellence drawing guests who never realized they were choosing safety along with luxury. Kane closed the folder, but didn't push it away. The timeline suggested a pattern, a systematic testing of resort defenses by organizations that had learned from Victor's failure. They were adapting, becoming more subtle, more patient. Paradise would need its quiet guardians more than ever. His watch marked another hour, another decision point. Through the window, he could see the harbor where luxury yachts bobbed beside working vessels, their contrasts representing the world he moved through, the gleaming surface and the hidden depths, the visible peace and the invisible guardians. Who maintained it? The folder contained everything he needed to start identifying vulnerable locations, to begin the process of hardening soft targets without destroying their essential appeal. It was work he understood, work he had perhaps been prepared for through every covert operation and midnight mission. A message from Cooper arrived. A simple video of the lagoon at sunset, the water painted gold and rose, paradise at its most perfect. But Kane's trained eye caught the subtle signs of improved security, the positioned cameras disguised as wildlife spotters, the staff moving with newly trained awareness, the quiet competence that turned a luxury resort into a hardened target without ever letting it show. 3 months later, Kane sat in a small cafe in Singapore's Marina Bay district. A travel magazine opened before him featuring a glossy spread on Blue Lagoon Resort. The article praised the location's seamless integration of security and luxury, though it focused primarily on the resort's enhanced diving programs and staff hospitality training. Between the lines, Kane could read Cooper's influence in every detail, though the former Special Operations diver was mentioned only as an enthusiastic activities director. Through the cafe's windows, the city's famous skyline stretched toward clouds that reminded him of that stormy night. Tourist groups moved past in cheerful clusters, their excited chatter a counterpoint to the serious thoughts occupying his mind. The Saudi executive's private letter had found its way to him through carefully maintained channels, detailing how their experience had catalyzed changes throughout the luxury resort industry. The executive's wife had written separately, describing how their children had processed the experience. Instead of being traumatized, they had developed an understanding of the quiet guardians who moved through the world, protecting others without recognition. Their daughter had even begun martial arts training, inspired by the controlled strength she'd witnessed. Maria and Elena's latest update outlined the subtle but significant changes they'd implemented at Blue Lagoon. The sisters had been promoted to senior management positions, their proven grace under pressure earning them authority to reshape the resort's operations. They'd woven security awareness into daily routines so skillfully that guests praised the attentive service without ever realizing they were being protected. Through his various intelligence channels, Kane had monitored the ripple effects of Victor's failed operation. The information gathered during that stormy night had led to coordinated actions across 3 continents, dismantling networks that had targeted luxury resorts and their wealthy guests. Victor himself, recognizing the shifting winds, had provided valuable intelligence from his detention facility, professional courtesy finally overriding loyalty to his former employers. A young woman approached his table, her casual movements masking the deliberate grace of a trained operator. "Command sends regards," she said quietly, sliding into the seat across from him. Her resort wear was perfectly chosen for the climate, but Kane noted the subtle bulge of a compact weapon beneath her light jacket. That business at Blue Lagoon started something interesting. Resort groups are implementing enhanced security protocols, but with such a light touch, most guests never notice. Your influence, I assume. Kane sipped his coffee, neither confirming nor denying. "Paradise is fragile," he replied softly, watching a tour group populate through the cafe's window. "Protect it too, obviously. You destroy what you're trying to preserve. Not obviously enough." He let the thought hang unfinished, but his companion nodded in understanding. "We've identified 3 more potential situations similar to Blue Lagoon," she continued, placing a thin folder on the table. "Remote locations, high-value targets, professional operators testing new approaches." The folder's contents included satellite imagery and surveillance photos that told a familiar story. Command thought you might be interested in a consulting role. "I'm retired," Kane said, but his hand still moved to open the folder. The photos inside showed patterns he recognized immediately. isolated resorts with limited access points, subtle signs of reconnaissance disguised as tourist activities, the kind of methodical preparation that spoke of professional operators planning their moves. "Of course you are," the woman smiled, "just like you were just a tourist at Blue Lagoon." She stood to leave, adjusting her jacket with the practiced ease of someone used to concealing equipment. "The dive master there, Cooper. He's done remarkable work. Several other resorts have adopted his integrated security protocols. Sometimes the best victories are the ones that look like simple improvements in service quality." Kane studied the photos more closely as she departed. Each location was unique, but the underlying vulnerabilities followed patterns he'd identified at Blue Lagoon. Places where Paradise's very isolation made it vulnerable, where the peace guests sought could become a weapon against them. His trained, I caught details others might miss, sightlines being mapped, patrol patterns being timed, the quiet preparation for operations that would shatter carefully maintained illusions. His phone buzzed with a message from Helena Santos. The resort was hosting what was publicly announced as a luxury tourism symposium, but would actually serve as a high-level security conference. Cooper was scheduled as a featured speaker, though his presentation focused on integrating safety measures with guest experience. The message ended with another invitation for Kane to return, this time genuinely as a tourist. The idea held a certain appeal, even as he recognized its impossibility. Men like him didn't rest, not really. They found their peace in movement, in the quiet satisfaction of preventing violence before it could shatter the illusions others lived within. His worn dive watch marked time as it had through countless operations, methodically, precisely, counting the moments between necessity and action. The woman had left another card beside the folder, this one bearing only a phone number. Kane recognized the pattern, a new unit being formed, one focused on protecting vulnerable paradises without compromising their essential nature. They wanted his experience, his understanding of how to weave security into the fabric of luxury without revealing its presence. Through the cafe window, he watched tourists stroll past, their faces bright with the excitement of exploration. None of them knew about the network of quiet professionals who worked to keep their illusions intact, who fought shadows so others could walk in light. That was how it should be, he reflected. The best security was the kind that felt like excellent service. A fresh intelligence brief had crossed his desk that morning, detailing how Victor's organization had been just one part of a larger network. All the groups were watching, learning from that failure, adapting their approaches to be more subtle, more patient. Paradise would need its quiet guardians more than ever. The folder contained preliminary analyses of vulnerable locations across Southeast Asia, the Caribbean, and the Indian Ocean. Each site presented unique challenges, but all shared common elements. Isolation that guests viewed as exclusivity, privacy that could become a liability, the delicate balance between security and serenity. Cooper's latest update included surveillance footage cleverly disguised as marketing materials. The video showed the lagoon at sunset, the water painted in brilliant golds and roses, paradise at its most perfect. But Kane's trained eye caught the subtle improvements. Cameras concealed as wildlife spotting equipment, staff moving with newly developed awareness, the quiet competence that transformed a luxury resort into a hardened target without ever letting it show. The woman's card seemed to carry extra weight as he slipped it into his pocket. The number represented more than just a new assignment. It was an opportunity to shape how Paradise would be protected in an increasingly dangerous world. The lessons learned at Blue Lagoon could serve as a template, a way to preserve the illusion of perfect peace by quietly, competently preparing for its defense. Kane made his decision. He reached for his phone and dialed the number left on the card. After 3 rings, a familiar voice answered, the tactical team leader from Blue Lagoon. I wondered how long it would take, the man said. The new unit needs someone who understands both sides, the need for security and the importance of preserving paradise. 3 conditions, Kane replied softly. Cooper gets consulted on all maritime operations. Maria and Elena's training program becomes the standard, and everything stays quiet, no publicity, no recognition. Already arranged, the team leader responded. We've learned that the best defense is the one nobody notices. When can you start? Kane looked at his reflection in the cafe window, remembering that stormy night when paradise revealed its teeth. I already have. Those 3 locations in the folder. I'll have preliminary assessments by tomorrow. As he ended the call, a final message arrived from Blue Lagoon. Helena had attached a photo of the sunset over the lagoon, the water as pristine as ever. But now Kane could spot the subtle signs of protection, the strategically positioned staff, the carefully designed security measures disguised as luxury amenities, the quiet competence that turned paradise into a fortress without ever letting it show. Paradise is worth protecting, he typed in response, then added, keep a bungalow ready. I might take that vacation someday. Rising from his table, Kane left payment for his coffee and a generous tip. Through the window, he watched another tour group arrive, their faces bright with excitement about experiencing their own piece of paradise. They would never know about the network of quiet professionals working to keep their dreams intact, and that was exactly as it should be. His worn dive watch marked another hour as he stepped into the Singapore sunshine. Paradise would always need its guardians, its quiet protectors who understood that the best security was invisible, that true strength lay not in showing force, but in preventing the need for it. Kane smiled slightly as he merged into the crowd of tourists. He had found his true calling, not just protecting paradise, but teaching others how to preserve it without losing what made it special in the first place. Sometimes the greatest victories were the ones that looked like nothing had happened at all. If you enjoyed this story of how paradise revealed its hidden strengths, make sure to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Tomorrow, we're bringing you another tale of quiet courage that will leave you breathless. And don't forget to share where you're watching from in the comments below. We love hearing from our global family of listeners who share our passion for stories that remind us that sometimes the greatest strength lies in silent vigilance. Remember, the best guardians are often the ones you never notice, moving through the world, protecting the peace that others take for granted. Join us tomorrow for another unforgettable story that will change how you see the world around you. Drop a like if this tale of Paradise's quiet defender touched something in you, and stay tuned for more stories that reveal the extraordinary in the ordinary. Until tomorrow, remember to look deeper. There's always more to the story than meets the eye.